What's up, guys? To start Unit 3, our first lesson is going to focus on the long-term causes of the Civil War. We'll get to the stuff that's much closer to the Civil War, but we're going to look at the things that were long-term leading up to the Civil War that were part of what caused the war to eventually break out. So let's get started. This is just a little image here to show you guys some issues that they were fighting over. And it's hard to see that red there. No peace without separation, no peace without abolition. The Union must be preserved at all hazards. So you can see the North and the South just had differences of opinions over the direction of the country. So that's going to divide the nation tremendously. You don't have to write this part down. These are just some of the issues, kind of just foreshadowing what we're going to be talking about over the next couple of slides here. So some of the political issues that are going to be long-term causes of the war, you're going to have the states' rights argument that we've talked a little bit about with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, versus the idea of the necessity of a strong national government. That's going to be South versus North. You're going to have the issue of nullification. Do states have the right to nullify and reject federal laws if they don't agree with them? Or is that something the states don't have the right to do? Again, South versus North. Both sides are going to interpret the Constitution a little bit differently. And of course, this is the dumb moment of the day, the two sides are going to have very different opinions on the future of slavery. Should it be allowed to expand, or should it have to cease expanding and remain only in the states in which it was prior to the country expanding into new territories? So let's get into all this. The first question here is states' rights versus a strong national government. And the big question we're trying to answer here is simply, how should power be distributed in the U.S. government? How should it be given out in the U.S. government? What we mean by that is, who should have the power? Should more power rest in the hands of the individual states like it was under the Articles of Confederation, where each state was kind of operating almost as its own little independent country of sorts? Or should the national government that's in charge, theoretically in charge of all the states, have the majority of the power, and the states just have a little bit of power left over, some power, but not near as much as they had under the Articles of Confederation? So how should power be distributed in the U.S. government? There's a difference of opinion here. If you support states' rights, and again, guys, states' rights is the view that states should have more power than the federal government. They have certain rights that should not be infringed upon or taken away by a powerful federal government. So if you're a supporter of states' rights, which was the South at this time, the South and states' rights, that's something those are things that are going to be connected throughout the Civil War era. So those people who support states' rights, they remind the U.S. of how easy it would be for a very strong central government to become a dictatorship like you saw with Great Britain, like they experienced with the American Revolution, that will then take away people's rights. They were still very fearful of that. They saw it firsthand. Now, we're a couple of generations removed from that, but the fear of that, the memory of that still remains, of how a very strong central government was abusing the rights and violating the rights of what are now the American citizens, but back then were the British subjects. Now, on the other side, you have the supporters of a strong national government. Now, primarily, these are going to be people that are located in the North. There were a few people in the South that supported a strong national government. Not everyone in the South was on board the secession bandwagon, but most of the supporters of a strong national government are going to be in the northern states. And they remind that the U.S. would be very chaotic. They remind people of what it was like under the Articles of Confederation. Remember that? When there was essentially no power in the central government, the government didn't have the power to tax, the government basically they could build a military, but they had no money to really pay anyone, so you really, in effect, couldn't have a military. There was no president, no chief executive, no national courts to settle disputes between people, between the different states. There was no national currency. The federal government could not regulate trade between the states. It was just mass chaos, and it got so bad, the situation was so bad, they had to get rid of the Articles, completely rip them up, and start a brand new government from scratch with the U.S. Constitution. Remember how bad it was? The U.S. government was so weak, they couldn't even put down Shays' Rebellion. There's a bunch of ragtag farmers who got together and started taking over courthouses in Massachusetts. They couldn't handle that. So they remind people of that time in U.S. history. So it's just a difference of opinion between the idea of who should have power in the U.S. government. Should it be the states that have more power or the national government? South versus North, part 1 there. The next issue you're going to look at is the nullification issue. The big question here is, if the federal government outlaws slavery, will the slave states be forced to follow the law? That's what we're talking about with nullification. To nullify a law means simply to reject it, to refuse to follow it. But the laws that we're talking about here are laws concerning slavery. If slavery happened to be outlawed, will the southern states be forced to follow that law, or do they have the right to nullify those laws, reject them, and refuse to follow them? Well, there's opinions on both sides of the aisle here. The supporters of nullification, which are going to be the South. So the South is all about states' rights. They're all about nullification because they're scared of what might happen if the federal government starts passing laws to outlaw slavery. So Southerners that support nullification believe that states need the right to nullify laws in case they're unconstitutional. They believe this is a way to protect their rights. So if the government overreaches with their power and passes laws that are unconstitutional, the states need to be able to say, no, we're not going to follow this law because it's against the Constitution. Now, really, that's just a justification for them to keep their slaves, but that was their constitutional argument. Remember going back to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that we talked about in Unit 2. That's where the nullification arguments were first written in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. Remember, John Adams passes the Alien and Sedition Acts as president. He signs them into law. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison think they are unconstitutional because it's basically violating the First Amendment rights of people, not allowing them to speak freely against the government and against the president. So they get together and they write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, saying that, and they start arguing for the first time in U.S. history that states have the right to nullify or reject a law that's not constitutional, like the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, at this point, we fast forward a little bit from that time, from the Federalist era, and now we're at a point where these nullification arguments are being made by a man named John C. Calhoun, who was the Vice President of the United States under Andrew Jackson. We talked about him a little bit in Unit 2, during the tariff crisis. Remember the tariff that was passed, and John C. Calhoun in South Carolina thought it hurt the South and favored the North, so they are threatening to nullify the tariff. They argue the state of South Carolina had that right to nullify a law if it's unconstitutional. So, and then if the federal government didn't, and this is where it gets even crazier, they also started to take the argument a step further. And they said, if the federal government doesn't allow us to nullify laws, then we have the right to secede. Southerners have the right to secede, leave the United States. That's what secede means, to leave the United States and to start a brand new country. So that's their argument. Now, the opponents of nullification, which are, again, primarily going to be the people in the North, they believe the exact opposite. They simply believe that states don't have the power to nullify a federal law. And if they did, it would likely tear the nation apart and bring war. So they're saying, look, guys, there's nowhere in the Constitution that says states have the right to nullify a law, even if it's unconstitutional. That's up to the Supreme Court to decide if a law is unconstitutional. And if you have states going around and nullifying whatever law they want, willy-nilly, then you're going to have absolute chaos in your country. Then no law is going to matter because there's no law that every state is going to 100% be on board with full force. So basically, if you allow one state like South Carolina to nullify a tariff law, well, that's going to open the door to any state to nullify any law that they don't agree with, and you're basically undermining the power of the federal government. If you undermine the power of the federal government, that could tear the nation apart and will eventually bring war. So that is their argument on the other side. Okay, the next issue of disagreement here, or area of disagreement, I should say, is the Constitution. So let's get into what we're looking at here. The big question is simply, how should the Constitution be interpreted? Each side, North versus South, is going to have a different way to interpret the Constitution. Now, if you look at the Constitution, it very clearly establishes a strong federal government. That was the purpose. Remember, the Articles of Confederation were too weak. The central government was too weak under the Articles for the government to really function, for the country to really be successful. So they knew they had to get rid of the Articles, create a new Constitution with a stronger federal government. So that's clear. But they also want to make sure that the states still have some power. The states aren't going to be as powerful as they once were under the Articles of Confederation, but they still do have some powers because the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution leaves several key issues open to the states. One of those key issues, it seems to be, is slavery, because the Constitution really does not make much mention of slavery outside of the fact that the slave trade will be revisited. That issue will be revisited in 1808. But should slavery, where it exists, be allowed to continue? That question is not really answered in the Constitution directly. So it's, how do you interpret it? Here's what the 10th Amendment says. The powers not delegated, which means not given to the United States by the Constitution, which is basically saying if the power is not given to the U.S. government, the federal government, directly in the Constitution, it's not written in there as a power of the federal government, and it's not expressly prohibited to the states, they are reserved to the states respectively or the people. So what that, long story short there, this is saying that if you're reading the Constitution, if it doesn't directly say that the federal government has a power or if it doesn't directly say that a state government doesn't have this power, then that means the states do have that power over that issue. Slavery was one of those things. So it's a different way to interpret it. Of course, if you're from the southern states, you interpret that as saying that states have the right, it's against states' rights argument, the states have the right to decide what they want to do within their own boundaries about slavery. If you're a individual that's from the north, you're going to interpret that as saying, well, if it's not directly given to the federal government, the states might have it, but slavery is an issue that the federal government should have power over. So how you interpret the Constitution is a different area that they look at here. Okay, the next thing I want to look at here is the Compromise of 1850. This is something that we'll look at in our next lesson as well when we get to the short-term causes, but let's kind of preview a little bit. The big question surrounding the Compromise of 1850 is this: should slavery be allowed to expand, particularly into the new territories that are quickly becoming states, and how can the balance of power be maintained in the Senate? So if you're a Southerner and you support the expansion of slavery, because remember, we're talking about manifest destiny, how the U.S. is adding a lot of land as we get closer and closer to the West Coast and the Pacific Ocean. Well, all those territories are eventually become states. That's the idea. So the big question you have to answer is, are those states going to allow slavery, or are those states going to outlaw slavery? This is a big question, because this is going to decide who has control of the Senate, of the laws that are passed. Is it going to be the northern states that are free states, or the southern states that are slave states? Because remember, every state has 2 senators. So when you add a new state, if it's a slave state, that means you've got 2 more senators that are going to be from slave states that support slavery. If it's a free state, that means you got 2 more senators from free states that are going to support the outlaw of slavery. So this could totally change the balance of power in which side, north or south, will be able to pass laws in the Senate to support their view, either outlawing slavery or keeping it legal. So if you support expanding slavery, you're from the South, you view the expansion of slavery as an absolute necessity in order to preserve the power of your section in the South. If slavery is not allowed to be expanded into these new territories that are becoming states, well, that means the Northerners, the free state people, are going to have more votes in the Senate. If they have more votes in the Senate, what kind of laws are they going to pass? That's right. They're going to pass laws that outlaw slavery. Well, if you're a northern abolitionist, remember, an abolitionist is someone who's anti-slavery, you want to abolish slavery. You are an opponent of expanding slavery because you view it as an inhuman institution, as evil. And because of that, it should not expand into land that's being required by the United States with things like the Louisiana Purchase, the Gadsden Purchase, the Mexican Cession, Texas Independence, Oregon, all those areas. So let's look at some of these areas. Remember Texas? We talked about that. Now the United States has pretty much all of this land here. California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico. All those areas are eventually become states. Are they free? Are they slave? California wants to be a state, especially after the 1849 gold rush and people are rushing out there. The Compromise of 1850, here's some of the details. Again, Henry Clay, the great compromiser. Once again, he's creating another compromise, just like he did with the Missouri Compromise. So here's what they decide. California will be added as a free state. But there's not another state that's quite ready to be added as a slave state. The idea would normally be, if we add a free state, well, let's add another slave state. But California at this time is the only one that's really ready to become a free state. There's a fugitive slave law that's going to be passed to make the Southerners happy. So if you add the free state, that makes the Northerners happy. Well, you got to give the Southerners something that's part of a compromise. So they give them a fugitive slave law. Slaves are running away in record numbers this time. And think about it, if you're a slave owner and a slave runs away, to you, that's like losing property. That's like if you woke up in the morning, your car is just gone from the driveway. That's your property. It's gone. Now, we know that slaves shouldn't be viewed as property. But back then, that's how Southerners viewed them. So the fugitive slave law made it illegal to try to help slaves run away to freedom, like on the Underground Railroad. So this is something that's going to make the Southerners very happy. They also then go ahead and turn around and outlaw, though, the slave trade in Washington, D.C. This is weird. You're still allowed to have slaves in Washington, D.C. You just simply can't trade them because they think that's a bad look in the nation's capital. And then here's what gets a little bit fishy here and kind of confusing. All that territory that they won in the Mexican Cession, those people that live there get to determine if they want to be slave states or free states based on what we call popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that people get to vote for themselves on what they want to happen in their state. So when New Mexico and some of those areas are ready to be added as states, Well, the people who live there will be able to vote if they want to be a slave state or a free state. So this is enough to at least get both sides to compromise. Really, it looks like it gave the North more, but both sides do compromise.